Good afternoon. This video is the lecture for chapters 18, 19, and 20. We're going to go through this. It'll be rather quick video, and then we'll finish off with 21, 22, 23 in the next video lecture. For those of you who are watching this right now, my suggestion to you is to go ahead and print out the PowerPoint for these chapters. I believe there's 6 slides in the PowerPoint. That way you can follow along because that's what the lecture is based off of. All right, let's begin. We talked about prisons, some of the programming with regard to prisons. Now we're going to go into what's happening with regard to incarceration. So the trends, what is causing people, or what are some of the reasons why we have people going to prison, and how we're trying to reduce that incarceration rate, what mechanisms work, which ones don't. So we'll start off with incarceration trends. From the early mid-1940s through the mid-1970s, incarceration rates stayed relatively stable throughout the United States, averaging about 100 persons incarcerated for every 100,000 in the population. So that's 1 out of every 1,000 people back in the 1940s through 1970s. So if you look at California specifically, at that time, that's when we had determinate sentencing. Or rather, indeterminate sentencing. Let me retract that. We had indeterminate sentencing. However, there was a dramatic increase with incarceration rates beginning in the late 70s. The book says 80s, but it was in the late 70s all the way through the early 2000s. In the early 80s, incarceration rates doubled to approximately 200 people, or 2 people for every 1,000 incarcerated within the 100,000 person general population. The highest rate that was seen was from 2006 to 2009, with approximately 500 persons incarcerated for every 100,000 in the population, would be 5 out of 1,000. So we're talking 5 times the amount from the 1940s to 1970s. So there was a huge increase in the population that was becoming incarcerated. Here in California, incarceration rates range from 300 to 400 incarcerated for every 100,000. So we're talking significant amounts of people. Now, people wonder why that happened from the 1980s through 2006 and 2009. So I'm going to get into the end part and move, and we're going to go back. So what I believe one of the major reasons was the movement from indeterminate sentencing to determinate sentencing, was number one, and the get tough on crime laws, what they called mandatory sentencing. So a lot of those mandatory sentences filled up the prisons with a number of people. The get tough on drug laws, so a lot of public order crime a lot of these state governments received, because you have to remember in the 1980s, that's when we the big push during the Reagan era was say no to drugs, and there was a big amount of money that got pushed from the federal government to the states to combat the drug crisis. And back then, it was like rock cocaine was the big push, rock cocaine and heroin. So obviously, with all this money, new law enforcement, new laws, and more people were getting arrested and convicted for these new laws. And then, of course, the convictions were causing a quick turnaround, a rotation of that prison population. As opposed to having individuals in for a significant period of time with indeterminate sentencing, and then having them go, well, I don't want to do that anymore. They were serving, 1 or 2 years, and that wasn't enough to deter their behavior, especially if they were selling drugs, because the amount of money that could be made with very little effort was pretty significant. Plus, you have to remember also, they weren't paying taxes on this, on these ill-gotten funds with regard to the drug trade enterprise. So many of these people, if they spent 2 or 3 years in prison, that was a really small price for them to pay, because they knew they can go back out and within weeks wind up, being back into the drug game and selling and making a lot of money again. So according to the United States Bureau of Statistics, the federal prison system, as well as 18 states, were operating above capacity. California was one of those states, and we talked about why California went to the above capacity, and I'll get a little bit deeper into it. So I'm kind of the mind that California was its own worst enemy. So what California did, at least the bureaucrats within the California prison system, when they would build a prison, they would build it for, say, X capacity. We'll say X is 2,000. But they would artificially say that the 2,000 was 190% capacity. So if it had 1,100, that was 100% capacity, which was quite literally about half, maybe a little bit more than half. So like a two-man cell could fit 2 people in with no problem. If you had 2 people, that cell was at 190% capacity. If you had 1 person in it, it was at 110% capacity. And and that was the design. That's how the California bureaucrats in the prison system designed it. So when they would go back to the legislature and they would say, okay, we have 18 prisons right now. They're all at least at 100% capacity, if not more. Some prisons are running at 140, some at 175, some are at 190. And so the politicians were like, oh my gosh, we got so many people in prison. We need to build more prisons. These ones are filling at the seams. We don't want to get in trouble for overcrowding because again, the courts they do maintain oversight now on the prisons more than they ever had. And so the legislature, because there was enough money through taxation and other government revenue generating means, they decided to go ahead and build more prisons. And of course, the correctional officers, their influence grew, right? They had quite a few more correctional officers. To this day, we have about 36,000 sworn peace officers within the Department of Corrections. Back in its heyday, it was something like 48,000. So that's a significant voting block that is going to vote. And so a lot of politicians listen to the correctional officers via the union, CCPOA, and the PACs, the political action committees. So there was a lot of power there. And part of that, again, was based off of sentencing laws and the way the Department of Corrections portrayed the idea of overcrowding. Researchers have claimed there are 5 reasons for increased incarceration population. You'll probably see these again. Increased arrests, we talked about that. Representing laws or represented laws. So this, again, what that means is the laws that we are putting on the books. And as a result of these new laws being on the books, people who are not captured in violation of these laws now are, right? So representing laws, new prison construction. Obviously, if you build it, they'll fill it. The war on drugs, and state and local politics. So all of these things researchers have found are the main reasons for increased incarceration populations. All right, moving on to slide number 2. Prison growth factors. Prisons are overcrowded, violate constitutional standards. They allow for, or they give decreased access to prison programs and services. They create administrative and management problems. And increase the propensity for violence among inmates. All of this is absolutely true if you have legitimate overcrowding, right? And there are some circumstances here in California where they did have legitimate overcrowding, but generally California really dealt with that pretty quickly. There were some institutions that did have to house inmates in the gyms and even move bunks into the day rooms in some instances. However, they acted on that pretty quickly, and only because they know the Department of Corrections realizes that the reason why they don't have as many problems as some of the other institutions is because of how they manage their population. They get well-trained staff. Now the institutional or the prison academy length is 12 weeks. It used to be 16. They consolidated some of it. They have hours and hours of on-the-job training. They have hours and hours of apprenticeship training, even before they become journeyman correctional officers. So there's quite a bit of training. They have their annual training requirements under post. So there's quite a bit of training. There's quite a bit of information available to the staff. They know what their responsibilities are. So California has been pretty good about making sure that people, the staff that are working there, are doing what they're supposed to be doing. So there's a lot of approaches, but there's 4 main ones that deal with overcrowding. Null strategy is the strategy of doing nothing to relieve prison overcrowding under the assumption that the problem is temporary and will equalize out over time. So this one right here, they're talking mainly about the idea of the ebb and flow with regard to incarceration. And it's true to a certain extent. I'll give you an example. As a parole agent, we would oftentimes see our inmate population go through the revocation process during specific times. So, starting in January, all the way through, say, March, we wouldn't have a lot of revocations. Why? Because it was kind of cold here in the Central Valley, and you don't get a lot of inmates or parolees going out and conducting business and getting themselves involved in issues. So they're basically inside their houses. When it starts warming up right around mid-late March all the way through, say, June, we get a pretty big spike in criminal behavior, especially violations of controlled substance use, property crimes, that kind of stuff. And the type of crimes that we see early on were, a lot of them were domestic violence and that kind of criminal behavior because they were inside their homes, right? And so they were in close proximity to their families, and they're volatile people for the most part anyway, so you'd have that. They'd get out, they'd engage in their criminality, go and use dope. Hey, it's warm, it's fine, it's nice. And so we get this uptick of arrest and revocations. And then it would slow down again as it started getting really warm, because here in the Central Valley, again, it gets really warm. As a matter of fact, I think it's supposed to be 105 degrees today and 107 tomorrow. So it's going to get warm, and it would slow down. These people would be back inside, not to warm up, but to cool down. And so you'd see less violations. And then as it cooled down a little bit more, you got into fall, you'd see another uptick. And that one would kind of ride for a little while, because that was during the period of time where we have a lot of holidays, right? We have Halloween. Parolees with kids would, that didn't have their kids because they're out running around, they feel bad about it. Same thing with Thanksgiving, and then, of course, Christmas and New Year's. So all of those holidays put an additional stress on a lot of these parolees, and they would revoke, they would violate their conditions in hopes of a revocation, because they really didn't want to have to deal with the emotional pressures that happened when they were outside, because the families would be like, well, why aren't you here with your kids, and why aren't you involved with the kids? And they don't want to hear that. They just want to go out and do what they want to do. And that was one of the big problems where we saw an increase, like kind of a spike, a rising rate of incarceration. And of course, and when it got towards December, January, it dropped off right after that, because again, we're back in the cool season. So there was a number of factors, and this null strategy kind of says that this ebb and flow allows the institutions to, their cycle of filling and releasing and filling and releasing doesn't really require any intervention. It's going to wind up happening, and just leave it alone, and it'll empty itself, basically. Construction strategy advocates building of new facilities to address the demand for more prison space. That's pretty self-explanatory. Intermediate sanctions is another mechanism to reduce overcrowding. So as opposed to putting somebody into prison, you use a community correction sanction in above and beyond the parole. So you would use home confinement, some type of residential treatment program or outpatient treatment program, cognitive behavioral programs to alleviate the need to put some of these revoked parolees back into prison. And the last approach to deal with overcrowding was prison population reduction. So that's kind of what we've adopted. We've adopted all of those things here to a certain extent. The last one has been a very recent phenomenon dating back from 2009 forward, 2008, 2009. That was the catalyst for that was the loss of tax revenue as a result of the housing crisis that happened. A lot of banks tanked, a lot of businesses closed, and as a result of that, people were laid off. And as a result of that, tax revenue dropped. And of course, when tax revenue drops, but our prison population is moving up, the people are going to be screaming to their representatives saying, well, we can't pay any more tax. We don't have any money to do it. So at that point, the legislators, as opposed to just taking CDC's word for it and saying, oh, yeah, we'll just build more prisons, they were like, well, let's see what's going on here. We need to. So they started having these oversight committees that were looking at prison operations and found that, again, the idea of the overcrowding. And then, of course, a lot of these cases went to court via the inmates with regard to violations of the Eighth Amendment, Clark, Coleman, and Armstrong, namely here in California, and Shoemate. And those court cases, caused the Department of Corrections quite a bit of distress. And as a result of that distress, the government decided to go ahead and start releasing certain inmates under different programs. We had NRP, non-revocable parole. We had Prop 47. We had AB 109, Prop 57, and then of course the changing in good time credit. They changed the inmate work training incentive program to give increased good time credit as opposed to just day for day. In some circumstances, inmates could actually earn 2 days for every day that they were in custody, and as long as they were programming. So there was a number of different approaches with regard to the work furlough release, prison population reduction. So those four: null strategy, construction, intermediate, and prison population reduction. We've used them all. The last one we've used, sadly, almost exclusively here in California within the last, say, 10 years. All right, moving on to number 3, race issues in corrections. Excuse me. So I see a lot of people talking about race, and it's interesting because race and ethnicity are completely different. Just for those of you who don't know, under the scientific definition of race, I am part Hispanic. I'm of mixed ancestry, actually. But even if you were Hispanic, completely Hispanic, under race, you wouldn't be considered Hispanic. You'd be considered Caucasian, because there's 4. And Hispanic is not one of them. Race is classified as the biological concept that divides humankind into categories related to skin color and other physical features. So it isn't specific to nationality. It's more specific to how we look, the idea of race, that there's certain physical features that each race maintains. I want to say there's, depending on what scientific journal you look at, there could be 3 or 4 or 5. So you have Black, you have Asian, you have Caucasian, and then you have Aborigine. And those are the 4. And I want to say there's one more, and I can't recall what it is off the top of my head. But those are actual races, the Aboriginal race. And the Aboriginal race, for those of you who don't know, is in the native Australian people, the ones that are living in Central Australia, not the ones who are living on in the coastal area. So Aborigine, Black, Asian, Caucasian. All right, ethnicity is different. It's the concept used to distinguish people according to cultural characteristics such as language, religion, food, and group traditions, and it is based on nationality, right? So ethnicity would be like, we have Europeans, but of course there's different ethnicities within Europe, right? So you have Spanish, and then you have Italian, and then you have German, and you have French, and each one of those is a different ethnic class, right? So ethnicity, race, 2 different animals. Disparity is the unequal treatment of one group, in this context, like the criminal justice system, compared to other groups. So by calling somebody, say, a convict, if they are out of prison, they've served their time, they're off of parole, they're still kind of pigeonholed as being convicts, and as a result of that, there are some laws that okay disparate treatment for this group of people, right? Some of those laws may include no possession of a firearm. Firearms can't be possessed by an individual that's been convicted of a felony unless they've received a pardon. That is a disparate treatment. That doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong, but it is a disparate treatment. This is not unlike discrimination, in which one group is treated differently without regard to behavioral qualifications. So Disparity is the unequal treatment. Discrimination, much the same, but it isn't. There is no, like, well, I don't want to say there is no, but there may not be any rational decision or rational purpose behind this disparate treatment. So the disparate treatment that we're talking about with regard to criminals, or convicts, if they're out, they can't have a gun. That's disparate treatment. Discrimination would be if, like, one person gave preferential treatment to the other person based off of things that were essentially superficial and could not be controlled by that one person. Now, one people would go, well, he can't control whether or not he can't have a gun. Yes, he could have, or she could have. If they wouldn't have engaged in criminal behavior, then they would be able to have the gun. So the disparate treatment there is not like the discriminatory treatment of one person being given another set of rules based off of, and we'll use the color of skin, right? So color of one's skin cannot be changed. Well, I mean, I guess you could argue that Michael Jackson went about it, but still, generally speaking, you can't change that, and that would be discrimination versus disparity. So they're similarly situated, much like we talked about before, the ideas of morals and ethics, right? They're very similarly situated, but there are distinctions between the two. So researchers have suggested a mechanism for ensuring laws and regulations that are passed do not adversely affect one race over another. This mechanism is called the racial impact statement. You will see that again. The racial impact statement would require a review of all new laws or regulations to ensure that they will not adversely affect any racial, will not affect or cause any racial or ethnic inequality. So those are the things they're looking at when they are passing new regulations or laws, and the idea of that is called the racial impact statement. Legislatures use that when they pass new laws. All right, moving on to slide number 4. Death penalty. Retribution, general deterrence, incapacitation. Those are the primary reason for the death penalty advocates citing for its continued use. So retribution, and we learned about what that is. Lex talionis, eye for an eye. General deterrence, right? We learned general deterrence is the idea of punishment so severe that the masses will look at that punishment and go, I am not going to engage in that behavior because I don't want to have to deal with that kind of punishment as well. And we learned a specific deterrence is people who experience the punishment not wanting to undergo that punishment again, so they refrain from that behavior. Although in death penalty situations, specific deterrence isn't really the main goal because the sentence already been passed. And then, of course, incapacitation. That's like the end-all be-all of incapacitation, because once you are the death sentence is carried out, the likelihood that you are going to re-engage in that type of behavior is almost negligible. Now, I say almost negligible because there has been stories where the ghost of the ghost of a person might come back and cause havoc or harm to somebody else. But for the most part, if the death penalty is passed and the sentence is carried out, you're probably not going to re-engage in criminal behavior. In the United States, mechanisms for carrying out the death penalty have evolved based on society's moral standards, and we talked about that, right? So punishments have ran the gamut from hanging, which was the primary mechanism back in the, from the 1700s, which was basically like a firing squad, to hanging. And then, of course, hanging became really prevalent, really big in the 1800s, and then moved into the 1900s, went to the gas chamber, and then to the electric chair, and then from the electric chair to where we're at now, lethal injection. But believe it or not, in some states, some of these methods of execution that we don't typically use are still on the books today and can be used. And they don't meet the or they do meet the standard of not being cruel and unusual. A number of persons executed in the United States for capital crimes has dropped dramatically since the 1930s. Between 1930 and 1967, 3,859 inmates were executed by state and federal authorities. You might want to remember these numbers. However, between 77 and 2017, only 1,452. So that's significantly less. We're looking at about 65% less. Current death row population in the United States is approximately 2,900 inmates. And if you were to look at that now, because we have that moratorium, if you guys don't know this, there is a moratorium. In 2016, there were two propositions that were on the books. I can't recall the propositions off the top of my head, but there were two. The first one was to do away with the death penalty in its entirety. The second moratorium was to speed up the death penalty process and minimize the opportunities for appeal of the actual case, basically to move the process along. And Californians, for the first one, for doing away with the actual death penalty, voted against it. So they voted against doing away with the death penalty. So they said, no, we want to keep the death penalty. Second, Californians voted to speed up. They voted for speeding up the process and limiting appeals. So you're probably wondering why, well, we don't have any more people on death row. And that's because in that same election cycle, we elected Governor Newsom. And he unilaterally made a decision that, in his mind, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's pretty much what he said, because the people of California voted for me, they knew my stance on the death penalty, and as such, expected me to do away with the death penalty. So Governor Newsom went and put a moratorium in effect and essentially closed down all death rows and essentially made all the inmates LWOPs, life without the possibility of parole. So again, that's just a moratorium. California's voted. Once he is out, then depending on what the new governor's position is, if he's going to maintain that moratorium or go back to the original law that was passed, we'll have to see. Again, Californians could also put on the ballot that with regard to propositions that are passed, the executive branch cannot supersede those without legislative approval, and that wasn't something that happened. So that said, right now there is a moratorium that's taken people off death row, but Californians did vote to speed up the process and to maintain the death penalty sentence. So public opinion in favor of the death penalty after 1965 has increased. Today, approximately 60% of the public is in favor of the death penalty, while 40% is opposed. And that's pretty much been universal, even in primarily liberal states. So even in progressive liberal states such as California, New York, Washington, Oregon, and those states, death penalty has stayed in the higher range, or there's been more people advocating for the death penalty than against it. All right, moving on to slide number 5. These are key Supreme Court decisions with regard to the death penalty. Furman v. Georgia, 1972, ruled that the death penalty is not unconstitutional. However, it could be a violation of the 8th Amendment depending on how it's administered. In other words, how they're doing it. Gregg v. Georgia, aggravating and mitigating factors must be included when considering the death sentence. Strickland v. Washington, capital cases, the defendant has a right to representation that meets the objective standard of reasonableness. Ford v. Wainwright, death penalty is unconstitutional under the 8th Amendment for people who are mentally ill at the time of the offense. Atkins v. Virginia, execution of developmentally disabled inmate was unconstitutional. Ring v. Arizona, capital cases where the death penalty is being considered. The jury, again, we discussed this, the jury is the one who makes a determination on factual decisions about whether the convicted person should receive the death penalty. So it isn't, pretty much in all situations other than capital cases where the death penalty is being considered, the judge is the one who exacts the sentence, except for this in this circumstance. And then Roper v. Simmons, 2005, death penalty is unconstitutional for juveniles, and we learned about that in a few chapters past with regard to juveniles not undergoing the death sentence or being sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. All right, and the last slide, condemned statistics. So these are some of the statistics with regard to condemned inmates. Most recent data for condemned inmates waiting execution is 98.1% of them are male. Of those, 55.8% are Caucasian, 1.9% African American, and the remaining 2.3 have some different ancestry. 42.8 have a high school diploma or GED. 9.4 have some college, and the remaining 47.9 have less than a high school education. Some cases below the 8th grade, and a great many of them, and that pretty much equals out to what the other groups were as well. All right. Let's see. 54.8 of condemned inmates were not married, 20.5 are, and 20% divorced. The remaining 3% are widowed. And the ages are 18 through 24.7, 25 through 34, 12.6, 35 to 44, 31.5, 45 to 54, 32.4, 55 years of age or older, 22.8. Most recent data shows 67.3% of death row inmates have prior felony convictions. So you're talking almost, three-quarters. So you're pretty close to three-quarters. You're right around two-thirds, a little over two-thirds. 9% have prior homicide conviction. 27.9 were on probation, parole, or in prison at the time of the offense. And that pretty much matches up to what we talked about before, that the 1% of the inmate parole population, or the parolee population, is roughly responsible for 30% of all crime within the community. So that 1% is responsible for 30%. So that's one of the reasons why we keep a really close eye on this small population, because we know that they engage in criminal behavior significantly more than the rest of the general population does. Approximately 42% of death row inmates are African American. African Americans also commit over 50% of all homicides, which does not indicate racial bias. So that was, we're trying to say that there might be some racial bias, but given the fact that you have this overwhelming number of African Americans committing homicides, they cannot see, there is some correlating data, but not necessarily causation. However, research has shown that juries are less likely to impose a death sentence in African Americans on African American murders as opposed to Caucasian on Caucasian homicides, or African American on Caucasian homicides. And there's a lot of data that's out there. You guys can do the research, especially on UCR or the National Incident Based Reporting System, NIBRS. Now, again, like I said, a lot of this stuff is correlation. And you guys should know the difference already now between the idea of correlation and causation. So, and that's an unfortunate fact that people will take, researchers are notorious for this, they'll take correlating data and utilize that as their basis for fact. And unfortunately, it's not very honest, and it's not a really good way to conduct a scientific research. I mean, a lot of people want to have the research validated. They have these ideas and they want to have the research validated. And when these numbers come out, they're trying to look for these, these connections, these correlations, and then they utilize these correlations as fact. An easy way, I remember watching this one video where they were talking about the difference between correlation and causation. So, and it's kind of ridiculous, but you'll kind of get what the idea is. So, if I made a statement that people who get ice cream are more likely to die of drowning, most people look at me kind of crazy. They're like, so if I eat ice cream, I'm going to die of drowning. That's ridiculous. But there is correlating data to suggest that, right? So what it is when people generally eat ice cream is during the summertime months. And during the summertime months, people also go swimming. So when you eat ice cream and you go swimming, even though those two activities don't have any correlation, because they're done in the summertime, there's some connection right there. And that connection is where some researchers are actually saying, okay, so people who eat ice cream are more likely to die of drowning or to suffer a drowning accident, right? And we know that not to be true. We know that more people swim in the summertime, more people eat ice cream in the summertime. There is a correlation between the two, but one does not cause the other. And so you just have to be aware of that. All right, well, that concludes chapters 18, 19, and 20. If there's any questions, issues, comments, or concerns, feel free to give me a text, call, or email, and I will see you on the last video coming up, which is 21, 22, and 23. Thank you much, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye now.